Welcome, and thank you for joining us for the first of 5 webinars in our Response to Intervention webinar series, sponsored by the Texas Education Agency and hosted at Southern Methodist University. My name is Leanne Ketterlin-Geller, and I am a professor in the Department of Education Policy and Leadership at SMU. We are happy that you are joining us for this event, and we hope that you will join us for the other webinars in this series as well. This webinar series provides a unique opportunity for educators from across the state to come together to learn more about implementing response to intervention in Texas. An expert in response to intervention will conduct each webinar focusing on content from the Texas Education Agency's Response to Intervention Guidance document. This document is scheduled to be released later this year and will be available as a mobile application and website. More information will be available from the Texas Education Agency. As attendees, you will be muted and your opportunity to ask questions will be via your GoToWebinar panel and the questions feature. You can send your questions to our moderators who will be able to address technical questions and pass content questions along to Dr. Lee. We have over 900 people registered to attend, so in the interest of time, Dr. Lee will address all content-related questions at the end of the webinar. We will address unanswered questions after the webinar with a frequently asked questions document that we will post to the Research in Mathematics Education website, or you can send specific questions to Dr. Lee, whose email will be posted at the end of the presentation. There will also be a link to the Research in Mathematics Education website for the FAQs on the email you receive after the webinar. This is where you'll also find a link to the Certificate of Completion and an archive recording of this webinar. At this time, I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Yasmin Lee, Principal of Diamond Hill Jarvis High School in Fort Worth ISD. Dr. Lee is an expert in response to intervention and has 18 years of experience as a principal at the elementary, middle, and high school levels. She has also been an assistant principal, teacher recruiter, and elementary bilingual teacher. She has an MED in bilingual and reading education and a PhD in reading. I will now turn it over to Dr. Lee.
Well, welcome to the participants. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Let's go ahead and get started. One of the questions that keeps coming up is, why are we moving towards RtI? Thinking about the methods and the resources that we've been using. And one of the primary reasons that we want to move on to RtI is so that we can make sure that our academic and behavioral needs of our students are being met, and that this is done through a formal process in order for identification or needs or the effects of the program, that they can be monitored and then make adjustments as are needed. There are some key principles for RtI that help it to be a successful framework. I would recommend that a universal screening take place. Later in the presentation, I'll show you some tools that you might use in order to review your students. The audience for sure could be elementary, middle school, or high school audiences. I'm going to speak to the high school level, but know that these principles, universal screening, tier 1, 2, and 3, progress monitoring, and then assessment data, these are relevant in all 3 levels. So in high school, the RtI framework is similar as it would be in elementary level or the middle school level. We would like to consider the tier 1 level to be the core instructional program. At the high school level, we begin to see some separations in the framework for RtI. We begin to see an instructional program. Oftentimes at this level, we see some separations by grade level, things that are really relevant to transitional 9th grade, but maybe are not as necessary as a student is at a junior or senior level, 11th or 12th grade. We do begin to see some at-risk behaviors that for this level we would consider at risk of not graduating from high school. And then we do see some social and relevant issues that pop up related to attendance or pregnancy, maybe substance abuse or behavioral intervention. And so what we'll find at the high school level is that many times these RTIs, it's not going to just be the one RTI program. You might have a separation in those programs. I call that the RTI team because since there would be several teams, instructional, grade level, at-risk, and social, these need to work comprehensively so that a student that's being monitored or helped through an RTI, it's possible that they might be involved in both an instructional and maybe an at-risk RTI model. So we have to look at those examples of interventions. For the purposes of this workshop, we're going to focus on the instructional. But if you do have questions related to the other kinds of RTIs, for example, the social or the at-risk, we can certainly address them in the questions. The examples of RTI at the different tier levels, with the first level being the core instructional level, we do want to set it up so that core instruction is strong. If your core program or your tier 1 is strengthened by developing study skills or having the students separated by grade level teams, automatically providing an after school help daily so that students don't gradually get behind, and perhaps adding an advisory period to your scheduled every week or maybe a couple times a week. These are some strategies that we can use to strengthen the core program. If a student isn't successful in that level, then we would look at a tier 2 or tier 3 intervention. And again, a universal screening and data management plan could help us to decide what that will look like. A question that I often get is, how do I get started with an RTI program at the school-wide level? And I think that if there are principals that are listening today, that's one of those very difficult tasks that you could have a team of individuals who are working with you to decide, what would be that process. But I do recommend that there are at least 4 things that need to be set up early on in order for you to establish that program. First of all, I think that those individuals that are going to be a part of the instructional RTI, that if you are overseen as the principal of the campus, that's really wonderful. But we know that at the high school level, that sometimes is difficult, and so that responsibility is shared with assistant principals or deans of instruction or associate principals. I think that the counselor needs to be a part of that team because the counselor is most informed about that instructional program, their courses, and the graduation plan. If you are working with a team of teachers, then you have a way to systematize monitoring and progress monitoring that student and implementing the interventions. But let's say that the situation is that you don't have grade level teams and you would like to establish that structure, but you don't yet have that. I would recommend then that you would do a school-wide RTI so that you do a general professional development so that everybody understands the relevance of when you're summoned to join an RTI committee meeting. Your expectation is that you would be having those teachers to be present even though they're not a part of a specific grade level team. But I do recommend a team approach when you're trying to implement RTI. The RTI school-wide plan does need to have an idea of a structure, and that structure may be that you will do RTI meetings before and after school. It could be that you have a common plan time, and so you will structure it so that that's accessible to parents. The process in RTI, once the meeting's being conducted, we will provide some documents that you can see related to an agenda, and that helps to keep everybody on the RTI meeting times so that you're able to go through the process and give everybody an opportunity to communicate and share strengths of the program or what's going on with the student, and then limitations, and then if there's a need for intervention that's able to take place. And then one of my strong recommendations is that a way for systematizing the RtI, that be looked at real strongly. Setting it up is not as difficult as managing it once you set it up. And so this is where I think that a tool like a master calendar or using a Outlook on your email might help individuals that are part of RtI committees, just help to automate that process, along with a few tools that I'll share with you in this presentation. When you're sitting down and implementing the RtI, you do want to review a needs assessment, and we share a document for that, but all that's involved in a needs assessment is really categorizing all of the resources that you have available, and also categorizing the situation that's going on with your students. It could be that you might have a universal screening of all your students' data, and you come to realize that 50% of the students are falling in a tier 2 or tier 3. That would be a very serious need for a system-wide RtI. That would suggest that maybe your core program or your tier 1 is not as strong. As a result, you have 50% of your children who are in tier 2 and tier 3. So this is where you as principal would want to also list that in the needs assessment, so that those participants can begin to contribute to solutions. And we'll share some tools that you can use in order to do that process of communication, so that you can think about the resources that you have available, some adjustments that might be needed, and then a plan of action so that you can have some high yield changes in your tier 1 program. But at the same time, you do want to see if there's a way to reduce the number of your students being served in tier 2. We definitely want to see our 2s move into 1, and we want to see our 3s move into a 2, and hopefully by the end of their high school program that they're exited and that they're now free of intervention support. I think that at this point I will just share that for high school model, there are lots of ways that we could categorize our kids into a tier 2 or a tier 3. I think that sometimes can be very tricky if you don't have a very strong definition of what do you consider the worst situation that a senior could find. And I think that the one that we should always consider is that they're not going to graduate from high school on time. So if you can decide what tier 1 looks like and then what tier 3 looks like, then I think that you can manage tier 2 with the different resources, and it may not be the same resource for every tier 2 student. The last thing that you would want to do before implementing is to lay out an action plan. And the action plan is 2 parts. You do consider the activity that needs to take place in the RtI, and that would include your periodic review. When the timing, sometimes we don't add intervention support until certain periods of time throughout the school calendar. And so being aware what those timetables are when you need the additional strong support, when especially if you've got limited resources, when you need to pull back those resources, if you're bringing in a tutor, if you're bringing in maybe additional personnel, or if you're doing a push-in model where you're supplementing a classroom so that you can strengthen core instruction, you will consider these things. But that action plan helps you to fulfill the goals that you're setting. And then the second part of that plan is going to be a goal sheet, so that you do set some goals for your program, and hopefully you'll achieve them. Or at least be able to talk about why the achievement may not be taking place or making progress. So the needs assessment, this is just a suggested format. It can definitely look different than this. I think that the educational service centers provide lots of formats for a needs assessment, but for an instructional RtI, we would want to be able to summarize the strengths of the instructional program. And if you are having some successes in your student performance data, to be able to articulate that. Communication may not seem like it would be a need, but if you're not yet completely deployed with a technology, and so some people don't have access to internet and or webmail, and they aren't in the loop, these are the sorts of things that could circumvent having a successful RtI organized meeting. People aren't getting their email or not aware that the meeting's taking place. Well, then they may be absent, and whenever a member is absent, that does affect how we deploy those interventions. Of course, resources, what are they, and the personnel that is available. I think that we're always going to have more needs for the one-to-one support that we see in a Tier 3 than personnel that's able to fulfill those. And that would be an example of a summary of needs. And then when you sit down and you think about your budgeting for the current year, if you're going to make some changes or amendments to a budget or transfers, you would want to be realistic about what that personnel cost could be, or the price of a new resource like a online intervention, or something that students could do outside of school, like a web-based tutorial program. And then of course, professional development. You would do the needs assessment after you've done the universal screening, and that's my recommendation. You certainly could do a needs assessment intermittently, so that you are aware of what's taking place at the beginning of a time period, in the middle of a time period, and at the end of a time period, in order to inform budgeting. But my recommendation, when you're sitting down and serious about the program, let's say that you're in that 50% of the schools at Tier 2 or Tier 3, I think that the universal screening of your student performance data is very important. Like I said, at the high school level, a Tier 3, at least for me, is at risk of not graduating. Well, why is that the situation? And really get down to the root cause of what's the obstacle in the path of the student. I think that will help you to then prioritize the rest of the resources in a school apart from the instructional program, so that you know what your priorities are. Okay, so the action plan, this, I told you, it was a two-part piece, the top part being just those action steps. I know that all of the schools have to do a CEIP, or a campus improvement plan, and I think that that's a really good guidance document. I would suggest that the RtI action plan is a subset of your larger campus improvement plan. It definitely is relevant because if you're very diligent on your RtI plan, you are going to have campus improvement, and kids are going to be successful, and teachers are going to be satisfied, and there's a great efficacy when you're implementing an RtI plan with fidelity. But I do think that it needs to be sort of a separated document, because those activities, especially if you're just implementing an RtI plan, it's going to be comprehensive. You will define your RtI activities, and that could include professional development, buying or contracting new resources, hiring new personnel or additional personnel, going through different kinds of intervention supports. At a high school level, you'll probably be looking at the 4 core and what sorts of materials are available for your students in order to help them be successful. And of course, if you are going to have an RtI where a teacher is the primary interventionist, or the number one individual, you may have that across 3 or 4 teachers if the student is struggling in the 4 core. So how do we work as a team in that? So that RtI action plan helps you to work through that process, and it's a recursive process. So you would revisit it right after you would do your needs assessment. You would revisit the action plan. So you can start simple, but you can see that if you keep adding to that document, that it becomes a really great tool for you to continue to review year after year as you're trying to strengthen your RTI plan and program. Clarify the roles and responsibilities of the committee. I have found that if you don't do that, that the committee members are confused about who is the organizer, who's keeping up with some schools will start with a binder, who's keeping up with the binder or the data, or making contact with the parents, or sending the invitation to the other staff that aren't a part of the teacher team, for example, a social worker or a counselor, or who's taking the notes. Some RTI plans are electronic. They're now part of their student information system. And so who's keying in the interventions and setting the new date? So I think that clarifying those roles help for every individual to have a responsibility and every responsibility being met. This action plan, it does help to set those dates. In the high school, it's really difficult to think about what would be convenient times where that many individuals could sit down and have that conversation. If we're dealing with a middle school or an elementary model, you might be dealing with maybe a couple of teachers, or in elementary you may be having the meeting with only the 1 or 2 teachers. But if you're in the high school level and all 7 teachers want to have that conversation, then you've got to be cognizant of how to organize that, and then setting up those monitors and reviews. And then make those expectations clear. Someone may ask, well, how frequently should the meeting take place at the high school level? I think that it's very important for your tier 3s to be visited no less than once a month. It would be fine once a 6 weeks after grades are posted, because at that level you are talking about credits, and just like college credits, the student is in for a section and they need to fulfill that, and so we just need to know, are they going to reach that goal? If you are able to do it more frequently, that'd be wonderful. But at the same time, you would have progress monitoring that's taking place, so that that individual who is the primary interventionist, let's say it's the English teacher, they're able to have the intermediate progress monitoring that's taking place, so that they can, if they need to have an urgent RTI meeting, let's say 2 weeks after the first meeting, because a plan isn't being executed successfully, students now talking about dropping out, then that's an immediate intervention. We've got to step in. And that can really happen realistically at any point in the school year. So let's go ahead and have a poll question. Give me an idea of the audience that we're speaking to. You'll have a couple of seconds to do that, I think about 30 seconds, and I'll see how many responses we have and let you know where we're going with it. Okay, so we're about 65%. It looks like there's a strong majority, 34% talking about or asking about implementation. Okay, we're closing the poll at 70%, and it looks like we've got questions related to scheduling the core instructional behavior program and implementation. Will it be able to address the other areas, establishing the plan, obtaining the resources and professional development, but we'll go on with implementation. One of the questions was scheduling the core instructional program, behavior program. So I think that it's really important at the high school level to talk about what is your tier 1 program. And there's different kinds of discussions related to what the tier 1 program ought to look like. But if you are doing RTI and are reflecting on these large numbers that are in tier 2 and tier 3, then you really, or my recommendation would be that you visit your core instructional program. At the high school level, and probably in middle school for the most part, maybe not 6th grade, but definitely 7th and 8th grade, we would see that Tier 1 is all of your students. So we wouldn't want to put a student who's in Tier 2, take them out of Tier 1 instruction, because Tier 1 instruction is the foundation instruction. That's what keeps our student on grade level and or in the right course. But at the same time, we do need to say, okay, well then, if we know what Tier 1 is, then what is Tier 3? Because Tier 3 is, this is what I called, in jeopardy of not graduating. And there are some reasons why that could happen. A student has some failed courses from earlier years. Now they're a whole grade level behind. What would be necessary in order to move that student so that he's not going to be in jeopardy? Or let's say that the student didn't fulfill a state assessment, and so now that's a category. One of the things that we really don't like to see at the high school level, but it does happen rarely, but it does happen. Let's say that a student was never identified as a student who needed support in special education. I had a situation one year where a student was an immigrant in the last 5 years, and so we wouldn't necessarily identify a student who's an immigrant with also a learning disability. That would really take a lot of attention in order to determine that was the specific cause. But as a senior, and really not being able to make the crossover and specialized testing, that was the result. So of course we had to put together a Tier 3 program that was involving all of these things, one-to-one and small group during the day in the classrooms, after school, before school, and Saturdays, so that student could get some specialized support, and then help outside the core. In other words, we had to make some exchanges with an elective course so that we could provide an additional supplemental course. It was in English language arts that we had to add a support in reading. So defining what would be the Tier 3, then you can really look at Tier 2 intervention. Tier 2 intervention at the secondary level, and I know that this is true for middle school also, we can supplement the English language arts and the math courses with an additional course, an elective course in reading or an elective course in a second math class. But that becomes very challenging if you're in the science or social studies area. You can create a structure so that the student has an off course, and within that off course, a rotation so that the student does get the English language arts 2 weeks, math 2 weeks, science 2 weeks, social studies 2 weeks. I wouldn't recommend doing it daily support in ELA, daily support in math, science, or social studies. I think that that's a very challenging system to manage. Even adding a course and then doing a rotation in the 4 subject areas, you would need money to do that. You would need to have the budget for that. Each one of those individuals would be a specialist working together and then managing those students through that rotation. So that would be an example of how to create a dynamic in order to support students in that structure. Another support that you could do at Tier 2 is outside of the school day, have a Saturday rotation so that they can pick up the additional support. I think that you would want to see if the student is making success in a Tier 2. If they're not making a success in a Tier 2, then you really do need to see what's going on in the instructional program. We have another poll question. We'll give you a few minutes to start responding. We're at 70%. Okay, great. So we're talking about how do we systematize, or do we have a tool so that we can systematize the RtI program, and then reporting the tracking and progress of students. Those are 2 of my favorite topics. I will definitely tell you that I am all about creating a tool so that as at the middle school or high school level, you'll have assistant principals or administrators who will help to support you. You're so busy as the principal that you need the information to feed up so that you can have an idea of the school-wide program. But how do we create a tool so that the tool that the AP or the assistant principal administrator is using can also help to give reporting on the progress of students? So let's talk about that. That part that I share with you, managing the data system, that slide and then materials that are related to that slide are really important to set up or systematize your method in your RtI. Now, all of this does fall under the implementation section. In the last poll question, we had asked about, well, how do I implement? So the components of an implementation will have to do with managing that data system, collaboration, communication, and then you will try to do the first round of RtI, and you're going to find that you're going to be met with some roadblocks because it is a very big structure within a high school level. Let's talk about managing the data systems. Okay, so this is my example of how to create a tool for you, the principal. My recommendation is if your data clerk or an individual that you feel are able to put this together, sit down and have a meeting with your RtI committee. Now, committee could be other individuals who can say, I need to get information back on students being served through special ed who are also being served through RtI. Two separate things, right? Because in one area they may be having accommodations, but in the classroom, there's discipline, their attendance, so that may not be a special ed accommodation. That's a situation that an RtI might look at. Another area might be, we do want to know, well, overall performance. You may have a tier 1 student that is not performing as well as you'd like them to see on campus-based assessment. So I would want to see after each assessment, how is my student progressing? So this tool is very simple. You have your data clerk or an individual who's very good at exporting a query from your student information system to just drop it into an Excel file. I know that many districts do provide a database for their student performance data, but you want a tool that has also these codes so that you do know where are the overlapping pieces in your RtI, because very likely there's another committee that's also having that conversation, and you want to be cognizant of that as you're trying to manage it. Another thing that I would add to an RtI document, I would include this is important to date your document, incidentally, because you do want to know attendance from point to point. Let's say that the reason for the lack of success is because the student is out all the time. Let's say that the student is a parent, and so sometimes they don't have childcare. And so now they're missing school. When they're at school, they're doing great, but when they're missing school, they're not doing great. So you would want to add that. That sometimes isn't something that's available in just a data performance document. Of course, discipline is always a contributor. And then you want to create some coding so that you know what was the outcome of the RtI, when is the review date, and I like to assign the responsibility to a different member of the committee. Okay, so if you have a committee that right now has 7 people sitting on it, 4 teachers, a counselor, a social worker, and the assistant principal, who is it that's going to touch base with that student ongoingly? So this is just something that I create, something that we keep it in an accessible area that is still safe. We might keep it internal with the teachers that are involved in it, but I as principal would want to keep the master and have that secure on it, right, so that we can make sure that information isn't inadvertently deleted or changed. The thing about this information is I would also filter the top so that you could do report tracking in progress. Because if you do have, let's say that you give the students all RtI Tier 3, and you want to see how they're doing on their campus-based assessments. So if I use that one tool with a filter, I can select my students being served under a Tier 3 and their ongoing performance. Because it's a one-stop document and I'm using it in Excel, I can also create counts in an Excel that if you have a person who's really good at Excel, they can set up tables on different sheets on your Excel document, and then you're able to see, the performance as it's going forward. And that's how you can make your reports and check on progress. Okay, so managing collaboration. The thing about being the principal is that you don't necessarily have to come up with all of the ideas. If there's anything that you want to have happen with your RtI, is you want the people who are involved to become owners in the process. Some of the best documents that have been created in the different places where I've been were created by the teaching group or the counseling group. They didn't necessarily become generated through me. So collaborating with the stakeholders helps for you to come up with that framework. And we talk about that process, structures, and that framework is really important. They also are going to be the people who will help you to manage those timetables. For sure, if you've got a common planning time and you decide to have RtI taking place second period during the 9th grade team time, that's where collaboration is very good, and they're able to continue to manage every student's RtI with that review process, which is so important. Okay, so we talked about high school teams. There are other kinds of RtIs that are available at this setting. Sometimes there are at-risk teams that are occupied by counselors, coordinators, intervention specialists. It would be good to have your administrator who's on the instructional RtI team to also be a member of the at-risk or social service teams, because this is where you've got the root cause, right? For example, the student who's also a parent. Well, they probably are having support through a social worker and parenting instruction. So you may get to the bottom of a situation and determine that we might have to supplement the program with some flexibility, some evening classes, or access on the weekend. So that's where collaboration really is important with the multiple teams in RtI. Well, so if there's anything that you need to do with RtI, it's definitely to keep the communication clear. And that's where reporting the progress is important. It's such a comprehensive process. I mean, it is about our business, and we're talking all the time about instruction. So to think that RtI is a very specific facet of our work, if we don't spell it out explicitly, then we don't realize the impact that we're having on the day-to-day work that we do. So I think that it's important to share the report of performance and kids that are having success and being able to exit RtI because they've met measures that were obstacles in the past. It's also important to talk about the structure of your RtI, and every year it may change because your program, when you implement, is going to be different when it's an institutionalized program and it's standardized. So letting folks know what are the new updates helps for people to stay in the loop. We talked about root causes and roadblocks. Those are sometimes not anything that you can solve right up front, but you do have to think about, well, how do we look at the different resources that are available and get to the root cause and then discuss some of the solutions. So we just provide a little tool that you can use. More than anything, if you're trying to come up with solutions by yourself, you may be short-sighting the effects. I think that doing this with the team, especially when there's an obstacle, that will turn out to have a better solution for your student. Okay, so I'm running out of time, so I'm going to get through the last couple of slides as briskly as possible. So we talked about when we set up the comprehensive needs assessment that we need to look at the resources. I shared with you a document where you can do a line by line. And I think that it's important to think about the different budgets that you might have available. Sometimes only one type of budget can pay for one type of resource and another for another, or a grant. But managing the resources and the budget are part of RtI and a part of our responsibility. So here's a simple worksheet that you can use. There's different types that are out there, but it just helps you to sort of line up your different funds and look at some of the very typical expenses that, you know, if you're familiar with 6100, 6200, 6300, you know, it's just that type of a worksheet. And of course, you know, you have to think about, I'm going to have to replace the scoreboard, so I've got to think about our capital outlay. So that's why you need everything on the worksheet. Personnel support. So selection and retention, I think that the worst thing that a principal can experience is after you've worked with a successful RtI team for one or two members to decide to stay home with the new baby or go to another school district or get promoted to a different level, and so you're thinking, oh my goodness, what am I going to do to manage or retain my RtI? I think that this is where the systemizing and the communication and the action plan is really important. You know, you're going to have a fluid RtI. It's not always going to be the same individuals year after year. So expect that you're going to have an implementation year. Expect that between year 1 and year 2, you will do some professional development in order to keep the team strong. Save the binder. It's sort of like the graduation binder. You only have the one, but you don't want to lose it. So be sure you keep track of it so that you can refer back as you're trying to train new staff. And do also, as the principal, we're usually the continuum, you know, also grow in your knowledge and ability to do RtI so that you can continue to train and conduct professional development. I think in this slide, the real key suggestion is having personnel assist in building the RtI teams. If you've got a group that's working with you, let's say that at my high school, I have a design team. Those are individuals who are not just RtI, but they help me to make the big decisions about the big rocks and boulders. I think that helps you to build a continuing plan in your selection and retention of your faculty. They help you to also identify folks that might be very strong and be willing to step up in that area and help us to support RtI. Last thing to talk about is the professional development. For sure, there are lots of how-to sessions that we provide that you can look on the website that will help to address student assessment cases, progress monitoring, and student interventions. So we're coming to the end, and I want to leave a few minutes for questions. I'm going to be opening up the floor for that.
Yes. So thank you very much, Dr. Lee, for a comprehensive presentation. I know I certainly enjoyed it. So I've been monitoring some of the questions, and thank you everybody for submitting questions. There are a number of questions that we're not going to have an opportunity to answer in the remaining minutes of the presentation, but we will post, as I mentioned, we'll post an archive of this webinar. We'll also post the references and resources that Dr. Lee has referenced on the link to the website that you get after this presentation or after the webinar concludes. So the first question is, several people asked a question about managing data. You referenced a tool for managing data. Have you seen this used across years? And someone was asking a question about using data over time to make the most efficient use of our instruction.
Well, I think that it's very important to keep historical data. You know, I've seen different types of management of data. I've seen sometimes where a student data is just so comprehensive that it makes it difficult to manage. I, as a principal, have liked to keep, if I'm at an elementary school, I do want to see the progress between first and fifth grade. So I do want to know the performance of my student in that timetable. But if you're in a sixth grade center and that's the only grade level, then that's the only data you have. So sometimes, that's not always accessible. I think that setting it up is important because that's going to end up being your tool. But the historical data helps you to have that argument. If, let's say that a student is being identified as not performing, let's say that they're a ninth grader, they just came in, and that's all the information the teacher has is the first 6 weeks report card. If you have historical data, then you're able to say, okay, but when you were in middle school, you were being very successful in English language arts. So what must have happened in the transition that you're now not being successful? So I think that it's important to have historical data. If after they're started in that ninth grade year, I think it's important to build new data because if the student is continuing to progress in that way, something may be taking place that wasn't identified beforehand. So like, for example, writing. Definitely writing at a secondary level is going to have a different kind of demand of a student than at a lower level. For example, they'll have to demonstrate some analytic thinking, and maybe that's an area that hadn't yet been addressed. But we can fix that, right? Because we know what's the problem.
Great, thank you. There were several questions about Tier 1, 2, and 3 instruction. And so there were some concerns that in many campuses, response to intervention is interpreted in different ways. And do you have any criteria that you use for the tiers and what those might look like on a campus? And have you seen where different campuses perceive of the tiers in different ways?
This would be an example where I would love to have like a sheet of paper and draw it out for you because I think it's important for teachers to come up with the definition of a tier 2 and a 3. But at the high school level, like I say, we should always include in a tier 3 the at risk of not graduating from high school. Okay, so that's because I would hate to put a ninth grader in a tier 3 because of some dramatically different reasoning than as a 12th grader who has a real, strong, probability of not graduating, right? So tier 3 is real important to define it. But let's say that this is a middle school or elementary school, and we have different reasons why we would that the student's not making progress, and so we now think that there could be dyslexia that was not identified because they could spell real well, or maybe they could comprehend real well, but they weren't able to decode. You see, so there's differences in the different levels, but for sure, I think it's important that the teachers come up with their rationale about a tier 2 and a rationale about the tier 3. Now, what I have seen, and this is where I wish I had a sheet of paper I could draw it out for you, the teachers, or at least the committees that I have worked with, they sometimes will categorize tier 2A, tier 2B, tier 2C, in other words, levels of tier 2 and levels of tier 3, and so they'll create additional codes. And so, it's just something that is the creativity of that group, and we appreciate that because for them that's a hypersensitivity. They feel like, no, this is so serious, this is intensive, I've got to call it tier 3. Okay.
Well, thank you. So there was a question where someone was asking about if you have a student or group of students who need tier 2 support in an academic subject and they need tier 2 support in behavior. How would you hold 2 meetings, or would you hold just one, or how would that fit in the information you've shared?
Okay, so in today's day and age, There's very strong probability that if they're in a larger district, they may end up having a student information system that also has RtI and PBIS in the system. If they have it in the system, which is wonderful, then you're able to conduct the meeting. And you're able to organize it with those stakeholders who are going to contribute to the intervention and the progress monitoring. You'll probably have to have a document that's separate for your PBIS because it may be a plan, it may be a contract, it may be an incentive, it may be just progress monitoring, checking back with me at the end of the day to see, did you go to class? Did you behave? Did you do a think it out sheet instead of, exploding and walking out? So, but that's the behavior side. Simultaneously, we know that behavior walks hand in hand with low performance. I mean, they're just, they're not distant cousins. They live in the same house, and so sometimes that's why they're not performing well academically either. So if you're having the same meeting at the same time, that's great if you have that in place. But sometimes that's not the situation, and so you end up having several individuals, or let's say that implementation hasn't yet, maybe the RtI on your SIS, Student Information System, is just RtI, it doesn't include the behavior intervention support. That's when I think that administrator or that individual who is the head of the committee is really important to bring those individuals into the meeting. I think you should have the one meeting, especially if you're organizing it because a parent needs to become involved. Of course, we always want to notify our parents of the RTIs, but we don't want to have parents coming back and forth. We need to take care of the need right then and there. But that's where, again, that individual who's in charge is the most important person in managing those meetings, organizing them.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. So we have time for one last question. And there were some questions about how do you promote or track fidelity of implementation within an RtI system?
Well, I've been a principal for a long time, and my recommendation, you should inspect what you expect. If you don't inspect it, then don't expect it. And that's why I create tools when we're setting up an RtI. I like to be a part of the organization. I may not be the individual or the administrator that's running it from that point on, but experience is a very important teacher, right? Very powerful. We've learned if we implement it for the first time and we have mistakes, which you can anticipate them, that helps to inform us in our process so that we then are able to, come back out of that mistake and have a success. It's always going to come back to the reporting pieces and the dates that meetings are taking place and the number of students that are being reviewed and the progress monitoring being monitored. I mean, these are just those, that follow-up is really key. And like in that review document or data document, review date, and setting that up so that it's accessible to you as principals so that you get those reports. I know that my administrators think I'm a real stinker that I have them to turn those into me weekly. But I need to know, it's a lot of students. I need to know that it's always a recurring process, that the students and their needs are being reviewed. So you do have to inspect that. Getting to that place, though, is a hard experience, right? You've got to have a lot of things organized and under control as a principal in order to also add that other piece, which is the monitoring.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who participated in this webinar. We also appreciate that you participated in sending in questions. We do have 4 more webinars in our webinar series on response to intervention. We hope that you will join us for those webinars. The questions that did not get answered, we will do our very best to provide responses to those, and also the materials will be available on the website. So I know several questions were asking for resources, and again, we will try to put those as much information as possible on the website. So please mark your calendars for these dates, upcoming dates, where we talk about RtI in reading, mathematics, behavior, and in writing. And thank you again for joining us. And thank you very much, Dr. Lee, for presenting with us today.
Thank you.